We continue our conference with panel 2, which is moderated by Professor Hank Greely from Stanford Law School. And this panel is about responsible quantum technology.
So some of you may be wondering why someone who does bioethics is moderating a panel here. If you're not wondering it, I'm wondering it, except I know the answer because Moritz twisted my elbow, twisted my arm, and asked me to do this. Although I get involved in the bio world in lots of very odd areas, from genetics and neuroscience and stem cell research and assisted reproduction, ex vivo brains, de-extincted mammoths. So far, it hasn't really involved anything quantum, with the possible exception of the few people in neuroscience who try to explain human consciousness as a quantum phenomenon and don't manage to convince anybody about that. But I am learning a lot and happy to be here and happy to introduce this panel on responsible quantum technology. We have 3 speakers. Each will speak briefly, and then we hope to have lots of time left in our 60 minutes for discussion with the audience, for discussion among the speakers, and so on. I'm going to introduce the speakers just before they speak, one at a time. The first one, I think, has already been introduced once, but maybe twice already? Just once. Okay, but you're going to be introduced a third time because you're coming back later on the program. Alina de Jong has a background in philosophy, communication science, journalism, and applied ethics. Her research focuses on the societal impact of new and emerging technologies and responsible research and innovation. She's a PhD candidate in philosophy and ethics of quantum-safe cryptography at the University of Amsterdam, and she's going to lay the foundation for this panel, talking about a couple of papers that she's recently been an author on. So, Alina, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. So I will combine my own introduction with an introduction to the 2 papers that we wrote with an international team, together with Glenn and Urs and also Maurits, about responsible quantum technologies. So, my name again is Alina de Jong. I was trained as a philosopher and an ethicist, and my personal research interests spring from my fascination with how technology mediates how we see and experience the world, the outer world, but also the inner world, and how this affects our morality, our values. So I'm really happy that it is now my job to do research on this topic, as I am a PhD candidate on the philosophy and ethics of quantum-safe cryptography at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And my research focuses on the philosophical and ethical questions regarding the development of quantum computers and their societal impact. And especially I will focus on the cybersecurity threat that they bring about and the society-wide transition that is called for in response, the transition towards quantum-safe cryptography. And basically what I hope to do is to develop the building blocks for thinking about responsible innovation in transitioning towards quantum-safe cryptography. And my research on this near to medium-term impact of quantum computers connects really well to our project about responsible quantum technologies, because in the 2 papers that we wrote, we tried to come up with an account of responsible innovation for quantum technologies more generally. And so that the account that we developed was necessarily less specified than my own research is, but that was exactly the point. So we wanted to create a conceptual fundament for responsible research and innovation in the realm of quantum technology. And we were brought together by Maurits Kopp. He really orchestrated our endeavor, and I think we can say that we all shared the feeling that that now, at this point, as we get closer to real-world applications of second-generation quantum technology, there is a momentum for thinking about how we can direct the impact of this technology towards desirable societal outcomes and away from undesirable outcomes. In other words, we agreed that the huge potential of quantum technologies and the associated societal impact they can have calls for a responsible approach to quantum technology. But what does that mean? What does it mean to innovate responsibly in the context of quantum technologies? So we developed a layered answer to that question. And at the first level, we conceptualized responsible quantum technology as quantum technology that seeks to maximize the positive impacts whilst minimizing any negative ones. Sure, you will say, but how? Great question. That's why we came up with the C framework. And according to this, this framework to work towards responsible quantum technology, responsible quantum innovation, responsible quantum technology is the result of an innovation process that integrates safeguarding against risks by proactively envisioning and addressing them, engaging stakeholders by involving them in the innovation process, and by advancing society by connecting quantum technology to societal issues. Great, sure, you will say, but how do we do this? That's why we propose 10 principles to work towards responsible quantum technology. And these principles are aimed at safeguarding against risks, engaging society, and advancing society. And I will go quickly through them. So the first is consider information security as an integral part of quantum technology. Proactively anticipate the malicious use of quantum applications. Seek international collaboration based on shared values. Consider our planet as the socio-technical environment in which quantum technology should function. Be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Pursue diverse quantum R&D communities in terms of disciplines and people. Link quantum R&D explicitly to desirable societal goals. Actively stimulate sustainable cross-disciplinary innovation. Create an ecosystem to learn about the possible uses and consequences of quantum technology. And facilitate dialogues with stakeholders to better envision possible quantum futures. So this is our layered account of responsible innovation in the context of quantum technologies, consisting of a concept, responsible quantum technology, a framework, the C framework with general objectives, and 10 principles to respond to these objectives in practice. Now, what is the payoff of this work? I don't think that we had the illusion that we created a list of magical principles that will comfortably lead us into a golden era of quantum technology. But I think that the concept of responsible quantum technology and the framework and the principles do raise awareness about the need for careful considering the societal impact of this second generation quantum technology. And the framework and the principles also kickstart a discussion about the kind of impact that we find desirable from a societal perspective and how we can work towards such impact. And in the meantime, we hope that the framework and the principles can already provide practical guidance to those in research, in industry, and in policy that are committed to responsible quantum technology and that already have to make decisions at this point, but who are navigating currently on a pretty misty sea. So we, hopefully, we made some navigation tools that will lead us in the right direction and that will help us make most out of quantum technology from a societal perspective. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Urs Gasser. Professor Gasser is Professor of Public Policy, Governance, and Innovative Technology and serves as the Rector of the, pardon my German mispronunciation, Hochschule für Politik, and Dean of the Technical University of Munich School of Social Sciences and Technology. His research focuses on the societal and regulatory implications of new technologies such as cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and quantum technology. Before joining TUM, he was executive director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, from 2009 to 2021 and professor of practice at Harvard Law School since 2013. Urs.
Well, pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Aline, for doing the heavy lifting on this panel right after lunch. So we're kind of the dessert, I guess, at this stage. So maybe just kind of picking it up also where we left it this morning and using some of the stage setting that Aline just did. A couple of things that are on my mind. I was just coming here to Stanford after 3 days attending a workshop focusing on generative AI at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. And obviously, I think AI and the question of good governance is on all our minds, and it also came up a couple of times this morning. And so one of the thoughts I have, or the questions I have, it's more a question is, well, as we move from one technology cycle to the next, it's probably also a sign of getting old that, it's not my first cycle. What can we learn, right? And what may carry over in terms of lessons learned and insight from one cycle of tech innovation that then some sort of interacts in complex ways with society to the next. And so I was just kind of hoping to offer 3.5 unresolved puzzles coming out of the AI governance and policy world as we now have this conversation about responsible quantum technology. So the first puzzle that I think we haven't really resolved when it comes to AI, and that may be amplified when we approach the quantum age, is the arts and science of managing trade-offs and tensions among competing policy goals. It was mentioned this morning already, also in the AI context, that Europe currently takes a more skeptical, or has taken a more skeptical approach towards AI, focusing very much on risk mitigation, but probably less focusing on the tremendous opportunities that come with AI technology. And Aline just pointed out that in our framework, we actually try to do both, which you see in this C framework, right? Yes, there is safeguarding, which is the risk management part, but there is also the idea of enabling and the idea of advancing society. And so to me, that's not a trivial question from a policy perspective. So for instance, we just surveyed about 700 AI bills in the US and across Europe. And what you see, if you look at the bills, what they actually say and what they seek to regulate, you see actually that some of the bills are either trying to constrain the use of AI in whatever context, whether it's health or transportation or criminal justice, or that you have bills that say, okay, we need to employ AI to improve, for instance, fraud detection, or to make X and Y more efficient, or we need to make investments in AI. And so the problem is somehow that we live in this world, in a policy and regulatory space where we target both risks and opportunities to some extent, but we don't bring it together in a coherent, or at least in a consistent way, so that we can have conversations about it, democratic decisions around it, how to navigate these trade-offs. So I believe quantum technology will be a wicked public policy problem, and our framework actually tries not to resolve or pretend that there will be no trade-offs and no tensions across different goals and values, but offer a framework how to work through some of these tensions. So that's the first point, like, can we advance in the arts and science of managing trade-offs? The second unresolved puzzle from AI, where I hope, as we have a second stab at it now when it comes to quantum technology, is some sort of the challenge to create an interoperable norm system. We've heard this morning, and I think it's very true for AI as well, that we live in an age where we have like different stacks of governance levels and different tools that we're using. So technical standards, ethical principles, hard laws, and everything in between, right? Shades of gray. And if you look at the AI landscape right now, it's true internationally, whether in Europe or here in the US, it's really a norms maze. We have technical standards that are emerging, many of them, some of them very specific, sectorial, others more cross-cutting around bias or the like. We have, horizontal rule sets like the AI Act that apply across context, but then we still have sectorial laws that may regulate in specific areas, such as health. And that creates a real web of norms that seek to steer behavior of actors and people, whether it's developers or users of AI. But we have very little in the toolbox right now that varies or designs for how these norms are going to work together. And that's true both within the jurisdiction. I think we already see contradicting norms that will be great for lawyers, so that's for sure, but it is also good for society that's less clear. So I do feel as we now move towards quantum technology, it will be even more important to think about these mechanisms to enhance norm interoperability. And that's why maybe starting with frameworks for responsible quantum technology can be a starting point to basically have a bigger tent, but think conceptually about the different elements within the framework and how the interactions may be organized. So the third point, our puzzle, is related to the second one. I do feel, and I like the notion of we need more governance labs, like the last panel ended. I do feel we are still lacking cooperation mechanisms and mechanisms for information exchange. This also has come up in the previous panel. That's true in a vertical way. So we see it currently in AI, I believe, very clearly when it comes to general purpose AI and generative AI, where we now see suddenly a mismatch between our focus over the past few years on addressing the developers of AI, but now suddenly the users of AI and different types of users of these systems come into focus too, and the question of their responsibility comes up, and this was also touched upon in the previous panel. So, okay, so where are the forums, where are the mechanisms, where are the learning processes that we can establish almost along the value chain of AI, but importantly, as we move forward, also along the value chain of quantum technology. So that's kind of the vertical. Just as one footnote to this vertical point, as the principles that we suggest, and it was also mentioned in this morning's conversation, emphasize the importance of participation. I think there we have an additional challenge that's a order of magnitude bigger when we talk about quantum, because in order to participate in discourse about what kind of quantum world we want to live in, you need a lot of knowledge. And as we heard for the non-scientists in the audience, as soon as we learn about the quantum physics, it gets really hard to understand what it really means. It's difficult enough with AI, but I feel these information asymmetries are getting more prominent as we move to quantum. And so in addition to these kind of vertical cooperation mechanisms, there are also horizontal ones, and I'm particularly worried about them, which is essentially the global conversation, right? So we talked about the arms race a bit this morning, but also about the majority world countries. If you think about the African continent, many parts maybe of Latin America, and how do we deal with the ethical and societal implications that we will have very unequal access to quantum technologies, including quantum computing resources potentially. We've seen stories, and Glenn is the expert, similar stories around access to essential medicine. Well, what if cloud computing becomes an essential infrastructure, and how do we deal with these global imbalances and asymmetries that may play out in dramatic ways? So there again, we see now with AI the call for new mechanisms like IPCC, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What would be the equivalent for AI? And I think we have to think what's the equivalent for for the quantum world. Is it an IPCC-like institution? I doubt, but we can discuss. And just to end with, the half puzzle is really about timing. It was mentioned today that, yes, we have this Collingridge dilemma. Either we regulate too early or too late. You introduced it. But I think it's even worse because the too late and too early is one dimension, but we have to deal with the possibility of tipping points where there is not only the question, what's the right timing, but the possibility that the world is an entirely different one after a certain point in time, although the story may have been long in the making, like in AI, but then you have this moment and it seems or feels things are no longer the same as before. And how do we anticipate that and how do we respond to that possibility seems to be a persisting challenge. So thank you.
It gives me a particular pleasure to introduce the third panelist who, like me, is from the bio world, and so I view him as a rock of safety and among all these you quantitized people. Glenn Cohen is the James A. Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law and a Deputy Dean at Harvard Law School. He and I are two of the three co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Biosciences. He has directed the Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics for more than a decade. And I think he may be the only person who works on more things than I do. According to his website, and I think this is an understatement, his current projects relate to medical AI, mobile health, and other health information technologies, abortion, reproduction, reproductive technology, the therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs, research ethics, organ transplantation, rationing in law and medicine, health policy, FDA law, translational medicine, medical tourism, and many other topics. So he's got a serious case of either academic ADHD or fear of missing out. In any event, here's Glenn.
It's never FOMO when I get to sit on a dais with these people. So if Urs is right, and we are the dessert course for you, what you've been offered so far has been more like a souffle or a creme brulee by my co-authors. It's subtle, it requires skill, it's light, and I fear that I'm going to offer you chocolate cake. You'll think maybe he's a bit basic, you'll think maybe he's a bit dense, but hopefully it will leave you satisfied nonetheless. So I want to start, basically I want to focus a little bit on kind of dualities, if you will, here, which I think has been what I've kind of been thinking about this morning and thinking about in the process of writing our paper together. One is a duality, and this came from talking to my father, who's 82 years old. He said, "What are you doing today?" I'm like, "I'm talking about quantum computing." He's like, "What's that?" And that was a challenging conversation just to explain it. But then very quickly he said, "So does it make a difference compared to the regular computing power we do now? Is it just faster, or is it really very different?" And I think this is a way of thinking about the legal and ethical questions, whether they're merely scalar versions of familiar questions we're facing with medical AI more generally, or whether, in terms of the legal and ethical questions, it's truly disruptive of the question. So thinking about new questions, and rather than putting pressure on how fast we have to move or how strong our governance. So that's the first duality. The second duality is this question about dual use. So when I think about the issues here, there are two analogies that come to mind. One is an area I, and Hank knows even more than I do about, the other I don't know that much about. The one that I know about is genetic technologies. The one I know less about is nuclear technologies, right? So is there a way in which the prior panel we had was like peeking into an early version of the Manhattan Project? Or is this like the early days of the discovery of DNA and genetic testing? And as I said, I don't know that much about the nuclear case, but I know fair enough about the genetic case that I thought was worth exploring a little bit. When we think about what is a dual-use technology genetics, the possibility of doing harm, and particularly militarized harm or terrorist harm with it, versus curing people, the idea that they have these multiple uses. So we could think of the analogies of gene editing, gain-of-function research, and genetic testing, right? So each of these are three variants, there are many others, of genetic technologies that have real dual-use possibilities that scare some people and push us towards precautionary principle modes or the like. Of the three, I have to say, I think the one that, to me, currently it's the most like is genetic testing. in that, here's why I don't think it's as much like gene editing or gain-of-function research. Those, to me, strike me as having much more centralized control of imports, exports, and also expertise. Where at a current moment, I take it from the people I've heard from this morning, where there is a lot of centralization of control over the quantum world, but it's not as though we think we'll be there forever, that it will only be a small number of people who will be able to play in the sandbox. So the technologies that are necessary to build quantum computing, I think, will become democratized relatively quickly. Maybe that's wrong, and it's worth talking about. In that respect, it resembles genetic testing. And here with genetic testing, I think what's interesting is that the number of non-threatening uses far exceeds the number of threatening uses. So there are versions of using genetic testing, for example, for Chinese work on the Uyghurs population and their persecution, for attempts to blackmail or extort individuals, for attempts to kind of learn about us and our genetic conditions and the like. These uses do exist, but most of us, I think, have a relatively benign, a somewhat corporatized, but relatively benign idea of what genetic testing has done for us and the availability it has both to learn on a research basis, but also a clinical basis. So my own view and my own hope is that the future of quantum computing looks more like the future of genetic testing, and that too has been a kind of scalar movement rather than a truly disruptive one, right? As the cost of sequencing has gone down and down and down, the amount of things we can do with it, the amount of things people are doing with it has gone up dramatically, and I think that's a possible future for quantum computing. Okay, I want to say two more things, then I'll subside. The first is just these questions about race dynamics. Now, this is much less about genes and much more about AI. It seems to me that there are two race dynamics right now that are possible. One is an international race dynamic. The other is a between company or a corporate race dynamic. In the LLM space right now, right now, we're seeing both dynamics at play. We're seeing a real race dynamic between China in particular and the US, and we're seeing a real race dynamic between OpenAI, Microsoft, and other players like Google. And what I will say about race dynamics is they are generally bad for ethics. When you are in a race dynamics, there are many things you worry about, but often ethics are one of the things you are willing to put to the side, because if you lose the race, it turns out winning the ethics doesn't mean such a big difference, right? So that's just something I'm curious about for the people who work on this, whether they feel we are already in a race dynamic, and what are the steps the government stacks to avoid that. The last thing to say is, and I thought this was a helpful distinction drawn earlier, is between asymmetrical development in the space versus symmetrical. So do we end up in an asymmetrical world where there is a world leader and it's us or it's China, maybe it's someone else, but it's probably the United States or China, versus a world where there is relatively homogeneous, or at least oligopolistic, if you will, development of these technologies? And one way of thinking about the question is, if I could tell you right now that there was a better than 50% chance we end up in an asymmetrical situation where we're either the winner or the loser, what would be the government stack's preferences you'd have for that world? Tell me winner, tell me loser, and then tell me what it is if your governance stacks kind of preferences if we have a symmetrical development of the technology. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about what responsible looks like and what steps you might take to avoid ending up in any of the boxes you don't like. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I want to open things up to the audience, but before I do, I want to pose a question to each of the three panelists that one of them suggested would be a good question to ask. And I thought that was a very good question to ask, and I'll start with Glenn and move down the line. What worries you most about quantum technologies?
I think it's my emails, actually, but her emails, if you will, right? So the idea of cryptography and the idea that everything I've ever written and I think is currently secure could be read easily with advances of quantum computing. And the idea that everything we know about protecting information the way we've been doing it for a considerable amount of time would go by the wayside. I think that would be a fascinating world to live in, right, where suddenly everything was readable, but it would be such a huge disruptive moment that I'd be terrified of what we might find out.
Your emails must be much more interesting than mine, Glenn. Mine would be a cure for sleeplessness. Urs?
Yeah, I may have an unexpected answer. I'm more worried that we will never get there, so that we will not have the quantum computing that would be able to unlock the promise that we talked about earlier today in areas such as climate change or or developing new medicines and the like. So I'm more worried that we're having a hypothetical conversation about the technology, which benefits we will not be able to harness.
And does that worry you mainly because of technical obstacles or because of political, social, other cultural obstacles to quantum computing?
So, as someone who works in Munich, where there is actually a hub for quantum computing called the Munich Quantum Valley, the reason is that actually my colleagues, some of the most senior researchers in the field, say, don't worry about the social implications. It may never happen. So I'm worried about what the scientists say about the likelihood that this will come about anytime soon.
I think, in addition also to the cybersecurity threat, of course, what worries me the most is that we do not reflect enough on the purposes for which we want to use quantum technology. So, for example, in a development, we can use AI for developing self-driving cars, but we can also use AI to enhance public transportation systems, which might be better for the environment. And I hope that we really are aware that we are now in the position to make this kind of choices in the development of quantum technology, and I would really, it would be my biggest worry that in 10, 20, 30 years we look back and we realize that we missed out on the opportunity to actually steer the development of this technological family not in the right direction. So that's, yeah. So I think by nature we are more appealed to addressing risks, but I think especially in this case we should also be occupied by thinking about the ways that we want to use it and the kind of society that we want to work towards, and the role that quantum technologies can play in working towards the direction.
I'm tempted to note that it's the lawyer who had the most practical answer, or down-to-earth answer. Questions from the audience? Yes. And Maureen, do we have a roving microphone?
I'll try to screen.
Okay.
So
For all of you asking questions from the audience, tell us your names so that the permanent record, which will be unencrypted by quantum technology, will reveal you forever.
Daniel Keremy, I wear many hats, but I'm also writing my PhD under Ursa's supervision.
Okay. So, who wants to take on those questions? One of you has to volunteer.
I'll start that I think that those are, exactly the kinds of things that worry me, to be honest. And I'll have to say, so again, you're going to think like I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist when I say this. When I hear the people from Google and NASA say publicly these are the things we're working on in Amazon, I have to imagine what is the US government working on and what is China working on in terms of advancements and the like and where they are that they're not talking about publicly. And I do think encryption and cryptography is probably the place where I think you are absolutely right. That if one, with nuclear, we got to mutually assured destruction, we got to balance of power. It took us a little bit of time, but we got there. Now, on the one hand, I think the ability of true dominance in the quantum space would not nearly be as threatening immediately or as destructive immediately as the ability to be the only person with a nuclear weapon would be. On the flip side, though, I think it's much subtler, much more insidious, and also that the idea of non-proliferation, I think, would be harder to get off the ground than with nuclear weapons. So if we do end up in this situation, I'm not as sure how we get out of it. And even nuclear, we haven't been that successful.
I might just offer an additional thought on the global justice or injustice dimension that you mentioned. I believe that digital participation gaps that we have and the digital divides that we have continue to be a problem, continue to be a barrier, even maybe especially when moving into an AI and then quantum world. And we see that already with AI, right? That in many parts of the world where these technologies may be the most productive, there is a lack of infrastructure almost as prerequisites to harness these benefits. So in the AI space, one of the examples that has impressed me most is about transportations in the favelas, where there's a case to be made that autonomous vehicles may be actually a really great idea to improve the state of transportation in these neighborhoods. And yet, one of the key barriers happens to be not so much the safety aspects and the like, but the lack of Google Maps infrastructure. And so I think this reality that many of the technologies we're talking about are relying on connectivity will just further increase the problem as we add more sophisticated technologies on top of the stack. And we had examples today where the resources are in the cloud. Well, but what if you can't access the cloud? Then you may have the most powerful hybrid engine in the cloud, but no way to access it, and that's a problem. So I'm really worried about this global ethical dimension and the injustice, and I don't see much progress on that front, and I think it's a shame that we don't do a better job.
Yeah, so really brief addition to that. I think if you're committed to equity, for example, then the quantum divide is a problem, and if you're not, then it's not really a problem. But then again, also, as I said earlier in my talk, if we want to make use of the quantum internet, of the fundamental privacy of quantum internet, it is key that another place in the world also has these capacities, because we cannot use the quantum internet if another country doesn't have the ability to be connected to the quantum internet. So not only from a moral perspective, it is important to bridge this quantum divide, or to let it not become too deep, but also from a more egoistic point of view, if we want to innovate, we should not only over-focus on our own capacities, but also think about why others need to have these capacities as well, so that we can make use of it. That would be the immoral argumentation line, but I think it partly works this way. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, up here, and then Timo.
Thank you. My name is Georg Ringe, Hamburg University, currently visiting at Stanford. I have a question to Urs in particular. So when listening to your three and a half points, it reminded me a lot on the idea of a regulatory sandbox, which I've been doing some work on. And the idea is to have a sort of collaboration space, a sort of mutual learning to address those big technological waves. And I was wondering to what extent you believe that could be a solution or part of a solution, and if so, at what level? Because as you pointed out, ideally we would need a global solution, and we're somehow getting to the limits of facilitative regulation in any case because it's territorial based. It goes to Eline's point a bit as well, but maybe I would love your thoughts also on that.
So thank you for the question. Yes, I think regulatory sandboxes are one of the few innovations we've seen over the past 20 years in governance, and are going to play a key role both in AI and potentially also in quantum technology and the regulatory arena. That being said, as you pointed out, it's only one instrument. And so my thinking is, what would be a more networked capacity that's some sort of scalable? And one model that I'm particularly intrigued by, that's also kind of spanning across public and private sector, is coming from cybersecurity. So some of you may be familiar with the Computer Emergency Response Teams, CERT, which started at Carnegie Mellon but became a thing globally, actually, where we've built the capacity both within companies but also within agencies to respond to cyber threats, and part of it is the exchange of threat information, part of it is responding to cyber incidents, and part of it is also capacity building and training and education. And it's a scalable and a networked model. I'm not saying it's perfect, of course not, but I find it intriguing by way of analogy to think about a truly networked capacity building approach in a world where we need all stakeholders somehow involved in one way or another. Now I would also hasten to add what that level of involvement is and what stakeholders we would have to participate in such a network. That to me is still an open question when we move towards quantum. And I was intrigued, Glenn, that you had some sort of if I understood correctly, an instinct that we will have a distributed quantum ecosystem. And I'm not so sure about that, and depending on that question, right, is it a fully distributed architecture where these quantum-based technologies are available to everyone or just to few or research institutions? That may shape some sort of the contours of this distributed network that I would envision borrowing, and I may be far-fetched, right, from this CERT model. But that's the direction I would go into. And just kind of the last, some sort of thought adding to it, I also see a real responsibility of academic institutions and of universities. And if you think of universities as a truly global infrastructure, potentially, with a commitment to the public interests, that could be a resource to leverage. And we have seen now with mis and disinformation academic networks, we have seen it, I think, in the Human Genome Project, and we've seen it in climate as well, where academic networks start to become a real backbone, not only of human collaboration, but also of learning and knowledge exchange. So these are a few thoughts in what direction I would look to, but it's definitely a Baustelle, as the Germans would say, right? Yeah. Construction, so.
Anyone else want to add anything? No? Timo.
Okay, thanks. Georg, we need to talk. I was almost to give a presentation on regulatory sandboxes today, but I haven't done it in Lund, so we need to talk. We're working on that as well in Copenhagen. Yeah, that's wonderful and an important topic, definitely. Maybe what I was missing, maybe you could highlight a little bit how interdisciplinary this paper really was, because we had some really, Raimund Laflamme, we had Bongersma in there. I don't know, I pronounced it probably not correctly. And where do we find this paper on responsible quantum technology? Because some people might want to look it up, so I thought maybe you could highlight that a little bit.
I think if you Google responsible quantum technology, I think it's the first paper conceptualizing it like this. So yeah, we have this first mover advantage.
Great, that's solved then. It's, I think, on the Stanford webpage and also on SSN, right? Yeah, great, thank you.
It's okay. Just a quick note, we are active in Brazil today on governance lab stuff, working on the AI Senate bill, and it literally is looking at net harms of the technology if it's successful, right, as well as other direct regulation elements. My question is for Hank and Professor Greely. What have you learned from the CRISPR debates, whether communicating with the public or communicating with the academy or government or NSF or the judiciary? What have you learned from that might be applicable here to quantum?
Well, I will answer your question to me after you answer my question for the group. Identify yourself.
Joshua Walker. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure this was in my job description to actually answer questions. I'm just supposed to be the moderator. So I do think from the CRISPR debate or CRISPR debates, one thing is the importance of broad communication in a very understandable way. Another is kind of no surprises or limit surprises. I think when bioscience has led to overreactions or strong reactions, I'm not necessarily going to say I think the reaction to He Jiankhui's CRISPR babies was an overreaction, certainly a strong reaction. I think part of it is because people didn't see it coming. They didn't have any expectation about it. Dolly the sheep. Nobody knew Dolly was coming except for the people at the Roslin Institute, and so as soon as Dolly's birth was announced, the newspapers were full of headlines about armies of cloned warrior slaves based on one sheep. So I think warning people, preparing people, being able to communicate well with people is an important issue. But I also think that every field has its own special pluses and minuses. One of the things about biology is us. So when you're talking about reproduction, everybody connects to that at a very visceral level in a way that they're not necessarily going to connect, even though quantum fluctuations are going on within our bodies. We don't think of ourselves as quantum beings in the same way. Neuroscience is even, I think, more strongly along that line. And I guess the last thing I'd say, one of the things in the biotechnologies that I'm not sure I see in the quantum world, there has been a strong driver of both investment and public support because those are almost always about human health. And human health is a trump card in many debates. If you can tell people that you're going to cure a terrible disease, they not only cut you a lot of slack, but they cut you big checks. I'm not sure there is an equivalent. I don't know. I don't know your field well enough to know whether there's an equivalent driver or a similar driver. Maybe the defense industry, the intelligence communities, and so on are equivalent or similar drivers, but they're going to be different in some ways. For one thing, they will lack the kind of moral compulsion that relieving human suffering gives in the biospace. So those are some random thoughts. But I do think all of the technologies are different, and yet they all rhyme. So you can learn something from all of them. Other questions? Yes, right up here. Do we have the microphone? A microphone?
Okay. Alessia Zernetta, UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. So the question is general. You mentioned multiple times like international cooperation, but I was wondering how realistic do you think it actually is, considering that my understanding is that there's the opposite tendency, that like countries are increasing export controls, limiting how much researchers can share with the research community and so on. So how realistic is it in the near future? And if it's not so realistic, what can the academic community, for instance, do to move towards that direction instead? Thank you.
Yeah, I can briefly start. I totally see your point. I think that if you take this system technology perspective and compare it to other system technologies, you see that no country ever managed to keep such a technology within national boundaries. So the technology itself will develop in cooperation and in international cooperation. And I think that the opportunity for the individual countries will be to establish themselves a unique position within that network. So the same goes for AI. Maybe at this point it is about the race to develop a more general model, but in time, different countries will specialize in certain AI, and I think that that the idea of international cooperation is really about developing the technology in general, and then the competitiveness or the competition part or the individual opportunities will come from countries being able to connect this technology to their own strengths. So there's when the competition steps in. But yeah, so there, yeah. So I really think that the race frame is misleading in that respect. Yeah, leave it to that.
I'll give a slightly different kind of answer, which is to say, so I've been impressed by, and Moritz deserves, and the organizers deserve a lot of credit, how international a group this is. But I'd be curious if I did a network analysis of you, how many of you trace to particular groups, particular postdocs, doctorates, and the like. And the tighter that network analysis is, the more confident I'd be at self-regulation, the looser the network regulation is. And I think one interesting example, again, from genetics is the International Society for Stem Cell Research, which has done a decent job of regulating many complicated ethically and also complicated in terms of health effects kinds of technologies. Not a perfect job by any stretch of the imagination. But I would have a lot more confidence the tighter the network analysis was, that quantum would be able to do things. The looser it was, the less confident I would be.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Michael Sun. I run a venture capital firm. I'm also a Stanford donor. So I have two questions. One is whether you've engaged with Chinese colleagues at Beijing University or Tsinghua University, let's say, for your papers to apply to Baidu, which only has a 10-qubit level machine, and also whether companies will accept penalties in case they break the framework. So let's say Meta is okay with paying $1.3 billion fine for something like this.
I'll speak for myself that I actually do a fair amount with colleagues at Tsinghua, again, more on the bio side than here, and I think it's really, China is the obvious other hub for this, so if you have a conversation that doesn't involve China, it's kind of a problem.
No, I think it's more of a point that you made, yeah. So international collaboration is also about not connecting only Europe to the US, but international collaboration globally. And I forgot what your second question was.
Fines inside, yeah.
Oh, I mean, IBM is the market leader in this 1121 qubit machine. But let's say you have Meta, who just was fined $1.3 billion today for data transfers. Whether a company like that would be okay paying such a big fine because it's a company incentive to increase the profit line.
That's maybe more your expertise.
I mean, if you look at the fine and some sort of what has led to the fine, I think there has been a lot of normative foundation building till you have actual actionable laws that can be enforced, right, by way of comparison. So if you look at the history of data protection law in Europe and in the US, that has taken us numerous decades to get to the point where we can actually fine companies for the sort of, at this level as we see it today. And I think what we're proposing here in the framework, that's much, and with the principle, is really early stage. This is like the fair information principles back in the days in the privacy discourse. So I think we're a long have a long way to go till some of these ideas that we shared today for discussion may crystallize, that then they could trigger fines. So I feel we have first to do a lot of norm building and legitimize through democratic processes what the guardrails are and the norms of the games ought to look like.
So unless we have unusually short questions and answers, I think we're down to time for only one more question. And let's move the microphone 1 meter to the man with the beard.
Thank you, Samuel Giga. I'm like a postdoc in Stanford, but a physicist. I want to ask Urs for his fear that he says, like, what if the technology doesn't happen? Because responsible also means that we shouldn't like let these technology possibilities go to waste. And like, do you have some ideas, or what are like your ways? How can we avoid quantum not to become like a global playing technology?
Well, that's the question actually you're better positioned to answer with a technological background than probably I am. I mean, I'm encouraged in the sense that at the national level, we've heard it earlier today and we'll hear it also from Timo later, there are, of course, massive efforts underway, massive investments also from the government in developing quantum technologies, and that gives hope. And we see all these research hubs and centers and research groups in industry and in the public, and I think that's what needs to happen. The question is also how patient are we? What are the timelines? And again, the analogy to AI is kind of interesting if you think about how many AI winters we have gone through and somehow got through the winter into the next spring, and then finally you see tremendous progress. Whether we're all happy with that is a different question. But so it's also a bit perhaps expectation management, also as we communicate with the public at large and taxpayers who quite often, and investors, right, who write the checks, as we said before. So perhaps that's a job too, to be realistic about the expectations and what the technologies can achieve and what not. And maybe along these lines also, we heard this morning, right, that for instance sensing may be far more advanced than computing in some ways, and maybe we also need to be more granular in what techniques and applications we're talking about. And I think there we did ourselves a disservice with AI. We have this term AI, which is problematic in itself because of the intelligence part, but then it subsumes or suggests it's one thing, and yet, you know, it's so many different things at the technological level and the application level. And maybe we can learn a lesson as we talk about quantum technologies, that we also start to differentiate. And I think today much of this differentiation has happened in panels.
And can I quickly add? I think also in reaction to what Urs said, but also what Hank said earlier, playing the devil's advocate for a little bit, of course we have to not overpromise things, but I think, contrary to also what I said in the morning about the importance of demystification, hype can also be productive. It can raise awareness and get attention for the field. So I think it's also really important to trigger each other's imagination and to get a whole group excited about thinking how we can use this technology. So a little bit of hype might be exactly what we need, and later we can control it again, and we have to demystify it. But it's important to make the technology sexy, so to say, so that we want to think about it, how we can use it. Because as far as I know, the field has made steady progress over the last decades. So there's no need to think that it won't happen. I think, but it's key to get a larger audience excited and to join forces in imagining how we want to use it.
Okay, so we've eaten only 63 seconds into your coffee break. And for that reason and many other better reasons, please join me in thanking our panelists.